Hi, I'm Kathy Whalen, and I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Boston Bates Business Network. For those of you who haven't been with us before, the Business Network is an organization of Bates alumni and parents and students that organizes events throughout the year to help participants meet one another, connect, and learn together, both personally and professionally. So we're delighted to have all of you here. Co-moderating this event with me tonight is Bruce Stangl, who's also a member of the steering committee of the Business Network. Bates is a fellow board trustee, and he is a Bates alum as well. Bruce is also an economist, which makes him vastly better qualified to moderate this event than I am. And before I turn the program over to Bruce to introduce our speakers, I just wanted to talk about tonight's format. We're going to start off with having each of our speakers make some initial remarks about our subject tonight. And after that, Bruce and I will pose some questions to the speakers. After those questions, the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions of your own. We are taping this tonight, so if you do have a question, please wait until our colleague Iman comes around to you with a microphone before posing that question. Okay, Bruce?
Great. Thanks, Kathy. So our first speaker tonight is James Poterba. And Jim is the Mitsui Professor of Economics at MIT. He's also the president of the National Bureau of Economic Research, otherwise known as NBER, which is probably the nation's most prestigious nonprofit economic research organization. Jim has an undergraduate degree in economics from Harvard and got the D.Phil degree in economics from Oxford, where he was also a Marshall Scholar. Jim's research focuses on how taxation affects the economic decisions of households and firms. He also studies saving behavior and portfolio decisions by individuals, and he has studied things like 401k plans that most of you probably have through work. Previously, Jim served as a member of the President's Advisory Panel on Federal Tax Reform in 2005. He's also a trustee of one of the largest fund companies in the world, known as CREF, the College Retirement Equity Fund. We have some professors here in the audience who are members of that fund. And he's a trustee of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. I've known Jim for many years. He's a resident of Belmont, where my wife Emily and I live. And Jim is married to Nancy Rose, a tenured professor at MIT in the economics department. You can imagine what those dinner conversations are like. Jim has at least two connections to Bates College that I know of. Jim and Nancy have 3 children. Their oldest son, Matt, applied to Bates, was actually accepted at Bates, and it came down to one of those last-minute decisions. Should I go to Bates or should I go to Hamilton? Well, we know how that came out. And Matt will be graduating from Hamilton this spring. At least he stayed in NESCAC, Jim. But their youngest child is Margaret, who's a junior in high school. And I understand that she's going to be on a college tour next week in Maine. So we're hoping we'll have a shot at another highly talented Poterba child. So Jim's going to talk first, and then I'll introduce Robert later.
It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening, and I want to thank Bruce and Kathy for inviting me to join you today. He alluded to my family of economists, and I will tell you that having 3 children with 2 economist parents, they have very different reactions to whether they think they should be doing economics, shouldn't. The oldest one actually is majoring in economics, but we were once on a family trip driving across Wyoming, and the subject somehow turned to what would happen if Pepsi went out of business. And Nancy and I were not doing anything, but the discussion in the back seat was about this. So the oldest and the youngest both were talking about, well, Some people really like Pepsi. What would happen? And the middle one, who's a biochemist and has never taken economics, said, I think Coke would raise prices. And we looked at each other. He's the one with the economics gene. As Bruce said, I work on a number of issues related to tax policy in my research career. And that generates more demand in February, March, and early April in the calendar for discussion about various policy-related issues than in other months of the year. And it's always a battle for me to decide whether I can take on a speaking engagement closer and closer to April 15th without running the risk that I won't finish my own taxes before I get there. But what I'd like to start our discussion by talking a little bit about tonight is the federal budget and tax policy. And we've just seen a new budget announcement from the administration at the beginning of this week. You all know that tax policy and budget policy is really central to not just the current election, but to a longer-term set of issues for the U.S. economy. And I thought I might just give you a quick overview of some of the core issues there, and then we can come back and return to more specific questions if you'd like in the later part of the presentation. So I've put together a 4-page handout that is at your place and has a number of charts. In fact, I really shouldn't say I've put them together. They're all just taken from the Congressional Budget Office's website, where there are some projections about their analysis of the current fiscal situation and the fiscal prospects for the U.S. economy. And I guess what I'd like to do to set the stage is to just say there are some long-term fiscal issues as well as some near-term fiscal issues facing the U.S. economy. The long-term issue has a lot to do with an aging population and a set of government programs on the books which provide substantial transfer payments to households at the end of the life cycle. So when you've got Social Security combined with Medicare and Medicaid providing resources to those disproportionately in the last few decades of life, and you run through a period when we have a baby boom followed by a baby bust, and you can basically see that the population fraction at older ages is going to increase going forward. That just puts a lot of intrinsic pressure on the fiscal system because you can project that there are going to be higher government outlays in the future. Okay? Now that's true. That's been true for a very long time. Okay? The people who are going to be 65 years and older than 65 by 2030 had all been born by 1965. Right? So we basically have known for a long time that we were going to go through this demographic transition and this would be expensive. This is harder in the US than it is in many other countries because when you make long-term projections, we've got rising healthcare costs as well as an aging population, and that's kind of a double whammy in terms of making this a burden. We knew that we had not fully funded these programs going forward for a long time, but it always seemed like it was a problem that we would get around to addressing sometime in the future. And then along came the 2008 Great Recession and the financial crisis. And what happened in the intervening couple of years was that the stimulus programs and the decline in revenues associated with the Great Recession meant that the US debt level for the federal government rose sharply during a very short period of time. Because these liabilities that are long-term liabilities for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, in some ways, if you think about the accounting, you might want to put them together and integrate them with the liabilities for federal debt. The U.S. fiscal position changed really quite sharply in a period of just a couple of years as a result of the recent financial crisis. So the reason that these issues have come home to roost and gotten much more attention today than even 5 years ago is because we've changed the positioning of where the U.S. economy is on this fiscal spectrum in terms of the long-term sustainability issues, the long-term prospect for where we are. Some of the recent work on looking at government borrowing, government debt through history. There's a book called This Time It's Different by Ken Rogoff, who's a colleague of Roberts at Harvard, and Carmen Reinhardt at the Peterson Institute in Washington, that basically talks about when governments start to get into difficulty in terms of their debt levels. It's very hard to know what the answer to that question is, but numbers like 90% of the GDP committed to debt are numbers that they talk about as potential sort of flags that you might start to look interested in. Well, the U.S. is suddenly in a position that looks very different than where we were a few years ago. And I want to show you that with just the first chart that's in this handout. The upper panel shows you the deficits and surpluses. There are a few surpluses in the late 1990s in the U.S., measured as a percentage of GDP For those of you who are not economists, GDP is about $15 trillion for the U.S. economy today, and you can do the arithmetic to figure out roughly what these things turn into in numbers. But what you can see is that in 2008, we went through this period of very sharply increased deficits, right? The actual numbers, that dark blue bit, goes down sharply in that year. And we've been recovering slowly since then, and that now we're at a point where we have about a 7 to 8% of GDP deficit for the current year. And then you see two projections going forward. One, which is the light shaded, and then the other, which is the dark shaded. The dark shaded one is what's called Congressional Budget Office baseline projection. The CBO by law has to look at whatever the law of the land is and assume that that's what's going to happen going forward. So if you remember that all of the tax changes we put in place in 2001 and 2003 are supposed to expire at the end of this year, that means when the CBO does this calculation under, quote, current law, they need to assume that that's going to happen. Well, that's what gets you back to this relatively modest level of deficits very quickly, so that you see that you're down to just about 2% of GDP as a deficit by even 2014. The CBO also does a calculation which doesn't quite fit their legal mandate, but is what they call their alternative fiscal scenario. And there they try to make other assumptions that might be more realistic as a guide to what may actually happen. So they assume, for example, that the tax cuts will not fully expire, but that most of the tax cuts will be extended. They assume that discretionary spending in the federal government as a share of GDP will not decline sharply in the years ahead, but rather will stay closer to stable. They assume that we may not manage to push all of the cuts onto Medicare that are currently on the books. The result of that is what they call the alternative fiscal scenario, and that shows you that we retain deficits to GDP someplace in the 6% range for most of the rest of the current decade. Okay? What that translates to is different projections for federal debt as a share of GDP going forward. The chart below, which is on a different year scale than the upper chart, shows you debt to GDP for the U.S. over roughly the last 65 years. And by the way, there's some delicate measurement issues of exactly what you should count and shouldn't count in debt. And Robert and I had an interesting set of email exchanges in getting ready for tonight. But this is the standard measure that CBO uses, and it's probably a pretty good guide, at least through time, as to what's happening. You see that the debt to GDP ratio was around 40% as recently as 2006 or 2007. And then in a span of less than 5 years, it rises to a value today of around 70%. It's going to close out this fiscal year at about 74% according to current projections. And then depending on whether you pursue the alternative fiscal scenario or the CBO baseline projection going forward, you either see a decline in debt to GDP on the baseline, taking you back to around 60% by a decade from now, or you continue to expand and are getting very close to 100% debt to GDP 10 years from now under the alternative fiscal scenario. The interesting thing to note is that we have seen levels of debt to GDP like that before in the U.S. At the end of the Second World War, that's where we were. But the one thing that's very different about the end of the Second World War and 2020 or 2022 is that in 1946, we were coming out of a period when we had rapid economic growth ahead. We had a very young population. We were about to start into the baby boom. We had lots of productivity growth that we were getting from some of the wartime R&D and other things like that. The scenario in 2022 may look very different than that, because instead of having tailwinds, we may have headwinds coming from the aging population and all that implies. So we could in 1946, we could run down the spending to GDP ratio sharply by demilitarizing. In 2022, we may not have quite the same opportunities unless we tackle some of the entitlement programs. So that gives you the starting point for where we are. Rather than walking through even the details of all the rest of the slides, I think what I want to just raise is the question of, well, how do we tackle this going forward? What are the options? In the budget speech, the president talked about a new variant of a high income tax, the Buffett. We've talked about the Buffett rule, taxes on people who make more than $1 million a year. I thought I would just give you a little information on what the distribution of tax liabilities and taxpayers in the U.S. economy looks like today, to kind of whet your appetite perhaps for a little bit more of this later. There were, in 2009, which is the most recent year for which we have data, there were 140 million tax returns filed in the U.S. Only 81 million of those tax returns had tax liability. Okay, now you've heard about this before, but it's basically that many people are filing tax returns either to get the withholding that was taken back, or that when they calculate net of credits, the earned income credit and other potential credits, they end up extinguishing their income tax liability. Most of those people are paying payroll taxes, right? They're paying FICA, but it's federal income taxes that I'm describing for you here. Okay, so when you want to think about who's the top 1%, it's actually a little tricky. Is it the 1% of 140 million, or is it 1% of 81 million as you look at this? Then let's look at the other end of the distribution and figure out what's happening at the very top. There were 235,000 returns with more than $1 million in AGI filed in 2009. There were 3.6 million returns filed with more than $200,000 in AGI. And the distribution, if you just kind of think about what this looks like, it's always sharply dropping when you get up to this rarefied part of the income distribution. So for example, 3.6 million over 200,000, 2.2 million over 250,000. So 3.6 over 200, but 1.4 million of those are between 200 and 250. Right? And you similarly would find that these things start to drop down. When you get to the highest category that the IRS will report information on, which is 10 million and above, there are 8,274 returns with more than $10 million in AGI. What about the taxes side? Okay, total taxes collected, about $860 billion in 2009. Of that, 434 billion came from people with above 200,000 in AGI. So roughly half is coming from that 3.6 million taxpayers who were in the over 200 group. And about a quarter is coming from the above $1 million group. $178 billion were collected from the 235,000 taxpayers with more than $1 million in AGI. Now, this sounds like a blizzard of numbers, I know, in an otherwise unsnowy winter in this part of the country. The thing I want to just leave you with on this is the tax number for those more than $1 million households is $178 billion. Okay? The deficits that I've shown you are 6% of GDP. Okay? They're on the order of $900 billion a year or something like that. Even if you double the tax take from the million and above households, you don't make. I mean, it's not trivial, right? But you're not going to close the deficit on doing something at the top, at the million and above. So what you basically have to do if you're going to do this on the tax side is to dig deeper into the distribution of taxpayers and work further down the distribution. There are basically only two ways to do this. One is by raising rates, and the other is by changing the definition of what we call taxable income and broadening the base. And there's broad consensus, I would say, amongst economists on the efficiency concerns in terms of where you will create the smaller distortions, that broadening the base, trying to include more things in income, would be the less distortionary way of trying to proceed. Now, that doesn't say you couldn't also do some redistribution, but the basic broadening of the base to include, for example, employer-provided health insurance, to include the value of owner-occupied rent that people get from living in their homes but not having to report that, quote, business income from being your own homeowner, the changes in deductions possibly for pensions and for IRAs and other things like that, changes in deductions for state and local income taxes, for charity. At MIT, if this is videotaped, I basically can't talk about that. But all of those things are part of what narrows the tax base. And the way that one might think about proceeding is by doing something which broadens out the base, and then you don't have to do nearly as much on the rate side if you do that. And there's another chart in here which shows you a bit about how much you can collect from different changes in that, but I'm not going to walk through the details there. The big challenge we're going to face going forward, and this is going to come up after the election, I think, because I don't think we're going to see major tax reform during 2012 rather. But the big challenge is going to be how we're going to proceed. Right? Are we going to really do a sweeping look at the tax code and try to figure out what we can do to collect more revenue in a relatively non-distortionary way, or are we going to continue just to tweak various provisions and try and do this? It is politically very difficult to go after most of these base broadening provisions to try to expand the tax base. When I was on the 2005 tax panel that made recommendations that Bruce alluded to, one of the things that I saw was that we recommended, for example, eliminating the state and local income tax deduction. And before the Senator Mack, who was the chairman of our commission, managed to finish his remarks at the Treasury Department, Senator Schumer from New York had already issued a press release explaining that he was deeply opposed to this feature of the new proposal that had just been made. So, every interest group and everyone who cares a lot is very focused on these things, and it is very hard to do it. In 1986, we did have this remarkable event when we managed to take a number of these deductions on. We broadened out the base. We lowered rates at that point, but you'll recall we also raised the capital gains rate to 28 that time as part of the bargain that left left us with a more level playing field. So there have to be compromises made. It's going to be very interesting to see how the politics play out. And I think I'm going to stop at that point and then let Robert speak for a bit, and we'll come back and talk more in questions. So thank you.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Jim. So our next speaker is Robert Barro, another person I've known for many years. Robert is the Paul Warburg Professor of Economics at Harvard. He has a curious attribute in his resume, and that is economists who like to measure everything have rankings of who publishes the most prestigious papers and then who cites those papers. And Robert is, at least one way of cutting that ranking, is the highest ranked and most frequently cited economist in the world. Isn't that true? Robert has a BS degree in physics from Caltech and a PhD from Harvard. I'm sure he's going to correct the record of what I'm about to say, but I'm sure there are a few people who majored in economics at Bates and other colleges, and many of you probably had Robert's textbook, Macroeconomics. It's one of the most popular undergraduate texts. He also has a grad school text, Economic Growth. Robert's research in the 1990s was mainly focused on the theoretical and empirical determinants of economic growth and innovation. In the last decade, though, he's broadened his research interests, and he's been doing things like investigating the influence of religion and popular culture on political economy. This work was done with his wife, Rachel McCleary, who's somewhere here in the audience. Together, Robert and Rachel recently completed a treatise entitled The Economics of Sainthood. So maybe afterwards we can talk about that. Just like at the Poterba household, you can imagine what these dinner conversations are like. In terms of like tonight's topic, Robert believes that the Keynesian multiplier is close to zero, and consequently, the benefit of government stimulus spending is also close to zero. Over the past 30 years, Robert has been a very prominent participant in the economic and public policy debates. He's a frequent contributor to the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. And lastly, I wanted to mention that Robert also has connections to Bates College like Jim does. Several years ago, he gave the introductory lecture for the Thomas Sowell Chair that's held by Professor Jim Hughes, which was a gift to the college from Janice and Joe Willett. And on a sadder note, when Robert was teaching at the University of Rochester, he was a graduate school advisor to David Ashauer, who unfortunately met an untimely death last August while competing in a triathlon. At any rate, I'm sure we're all going to enjoy Robert's remarks. Thank you very much.
So I thought we had all gathered here to talk about saints, but apparently I'm supposed to say something about the macroeconomic outlook, so I guess I will shift to that topic instead. I was asked before the session whether I was planning to be optimistic or not, and I don't know if I'm going to do too well on that ground, but but you can judge, I suppose. So I think the U.S. and to some extent globally, we're in the middle of a very weak economic recovery from the recession that was the most severe, certainly in the post-World War II period. So I think the best measure of the extent of the recovery and the extent of the recession is the growth rate of the real gross domestic product. And basically, since the end of the recession, which ended in early 2009, the economy in the U.S. has been growing at a rate that's about 2% per year. So that would normally be characterized as an extremely weak economic recovery, though I noticed that over time, people's standard about what's acceptable and sort of attractive about the economy has been changing, and somehow it's supposed to be a good thing when the GDP growth is positive. Of course, the long-run average is about 3% per year in the US. Another way to look at this is that in the recession, the decline in the real gross domestic product cumulatively was about 10% relative to trend. And that means you would have to make up that difference to get back to the previous trend. In order to do that, you'd have to be growing at a rate of something over 4% for quite a while. That's the kind of strong economic recovery we actually did have in the 1980s and in the 1990s, but it's nothing like what's been occurring today. So that's a very negative sign with respect to the economic situation. It is true that the labor market recently, in the last several months, has looked better than it did before, gauged either by employment expansion from the payroll reports or gauged by the declining unemployment rate. But it's a very weak recovery gauged by the labor market. And moreover, the labor market is not usually viewed as a leading indicator of what's going to happen. So I think it's actually better to focus on what is in the GDP numbers rather than in the labor market. But the labor report gets the most attention, partly because it's a monthly statistic, and you can see it announced each time on the first Friday of each month, and it's an exciting kind of event. The other aspect of the U.S. economy is not so much that it's a weak situation and that we have something that looks like stagnation, but there's also continuing threats of something much worse than that happening, something that would look more like a disaster kind of macroeconomic event. And I don't think we're out of the woods with regard to that possibility, even though the worst may have been early in 2009. In the current environment, I think two of the